Hi friends, welcome to my channel. I'll begin my stories from the origin of our people. You all know that we were the Romans, but who were the Romans? Where did they come from? Now I'll tell you about it. The ancestors of the Romans were the Latians, but the Latians were not the indigenous people of Italy. At least 30,000 years ago, the plains of Italy were inhabited by other people. These people gathered the fruits of wild plants and hunted wild animals. 8,000 years ago, farmers from Anatolia appeared in Italy. They fashioned pottery, made tools and weapons of polished stone, domesticated animals. Some of them lived in caves, others in small huts. The descendants of these people were in my time the Etruscans and the Ligurians in Italy, and the Iberians in Spain. And about 4,000 years ago, northern Italy was invaded by Indo-European tribes from the East European steppes. They grazed herds, tilled the soil, wove clothing, fired pottery, and out of bronze they forged 100 varieties of tools and weapons. Initially, they settled the Valley of the Po, and then, about 3,000 years ago, their descendants learned use of iron, made from it improved implements, and, so armed, spread their culture far down into Italy. These were two peoples, or rather two branches of the same Indo-European people, which was divided into the two tribes of the Latins and the Umbrians. The Umbrians occupied the territory along the central mountain ridge of Italy, and the Latins along the west coast. Initially, the Latin tribes occupied all southwestern Italy. They lived in Campania, Lucania, and in the eastern half of Sicily. Destinies very dissimilar awaited these different tribes. Those settled in Sicily and Campania came into contact with the Greeks at a period when they were unable to offer resistance to their civilization and were completely alienized. It was otherwise with Latium, where no Greek colonies were founded, and the inhabitants were successful in maintaining their ground against their neighbors. Let's look at this district. Latium is bounded on the east by the mountains of the Sabines, and on the south by the Volscian Range. On the west, its boundary is the sea, which on this part of the coast forms but few and indifferent harbors. And the north boundary is the Tiber. This region is a homeland of the Latins, and it has since borne their name. The Tiber formed its northern boundary. All the country north of the Tiber was to the Latins a foreign and even hostile domain, with whose inhabitants no alliance, no public peace was possible. Only the land between the Tiber, the Apennines, the Alban Mount, and the sea was the land of the Latins. Hills here and there emerge, like islands from the plain. Some of them steep limestone cliffs, others volcanic elevations whose extinct craters had become converted into lakes. In those early days, the Latins have been divided into a number of clans. These were Aemilii, Cornelii, Sergii, Fabii, Horatii, and others. These clans, however, were not independent societies. They all were parts of political communities, called civitas or populus, and bounded to mutual observance of law and to united action in aggression and defense. Each of these communities needed an own local center. but as the members of the clans lived in their villages, the center of the community cannot have been a place of joint settlement. It must have been simply a place of common assembly, and a place where in case of war the members of community obtained for themselves a safer shelter than in their villages. Usually, this place of meeting was not inhabited, but these fortresses were the basis of that constitution which prevailed in Italy anterior to the existence of towns. The Latins first settled on the isolated Alban mountains, that natural stronghold of Latium, which offered to the settlers most wholesome air, the freshest springs, and the most secure position. Here, between the Alban lake and the Alban mount, extended the town of Alba, which was the primitive seat of the Latin tribe, and the mother city of Rome, as well as of all the other old Latin communities. Here too, on the slopes, lay the very ancient Latin community centers of Lanuvium, Aricia, and Tusculum. The Latin fortresses on the last offshoots of the Sabine range gave rise at later period to the towns of Tibur and Praeneste, Labici too, Gabii, and Nomentum in the plain between the Alban and Sabine hills and the Tiber, Rome on the Tiber, Laurentum and Lavinium on the coast, were all ancient centers of Latin colonization. All these communities were in primitive times politically sovereign, and each of them was governed by its leader, with the cooperation of the Council of Elders and the Assembly of Warriors. Nevertheless, the feeling of fellowship based on community of descent and of language not only pervaded the whole of them, but manifested itself in an important religious and political institution, the League of the Latin Communities. The rendezvous of this union was the Latin festival, at which, on the Mount of Alba, an ox was offered in sacrifice by the assembled Latin tribes to the Latin god. Each community taking part in the ceremony had to contribute to the feast its fixed portion of cattle, milk, and cheese, and to receive in return a portion of the roasted victim. In connection with this religious festival on the Mount of Alba, took place assemblies of the leaders of the communities. Indeed, such a union couldn't exist without a supreme governing body and a system of law binding on all. This Latin League was for a long time the necessary expression of the relationship of the Latin tribes. This is the earliest history of the Latins, a people which later founded Rome. We'll talk about it in the next program. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss it. At this point, I wish to conclude this video. If it was interesting, leave comments, put likes and repost. Thank you for your attention. See you later. Goodbye.